yet. And didn't she have a mind of her own? The evidence is definitely that she did.
Also speaks to the kind what you write about with Jefferson, which is a kind of noticeable ardor even at a young age, and the fact that I think, as you put it, there's been too much hagiography. This is a man who is presented as, taking right from your phrasing, Christopher, perhaps not even a male mammal. I mean, the idea of turning him into this saint, the fact of the matter was, not only did he have the ardor, but there's kind of proof in the notion of what you offer in the book, which is that he came up with these, the best adjective I can think of to describe it, cockamamie theories about race later on, and how, since she was a quadroon and was lighter skinned, therefore it seemed to dissociate her from some of the more stereotypical or presumptuous notions about Africans.
Yes, but of course the existence of octoroons, as people, and quadroons, as people used to call them, is itself proof of sex being forced on slaves. And so their very presence is a kind of reminder. So I think there may have been a guilty thrill, as well as the more obvious kinds of thrill. But to those more obvious kinds, we know he was very much prey from a young age. He was repeatedly getting into trouble with making advances to the wives of friends, making advances too soon to the divine Rebecca Burwell, who I think he'd hoped to marry, who rejected him, sending letters with dick jokes in them when he's in Paris to Maria Cosway. I must say, it did surprise me coming across a letter full of cock jokes from Thomas Jefferson, but I shouldn't have been surprised. I mean,
well, on the other
men
hand,
are not all that different.
Yeah, but you say you talk about his relationship with Lawrence Stearns Tristram Shandy, and it sounds like he has no sense of humor. In fact, you mentioned a couple of times he appears to have no sense of humor.
Yeah, the hardest thing about writing about him is the realization that he would have been a very dry companion in many ways. Not without wit.
But he still makes phallus jokes, though.
Yeah, but he still makes phallus jokes, but he doesn't. But he's very humorless, especially in respect of himself. And the description of him in Gore Vidal's novel Burr strikes me as just about exactly right. As a very ruthless, rather cold, single-minded, very brilliant, very hard-working person, but with
someone like Vidal himself.
Not many laughs. Well, Gore can be funny.
Yes, he can, actually. I'll give him that. But the other thing about Jefferson, terrible speaker. I mean,
couldn't give a public speech. His inaugural speeches were inaudible. He wrote them out well, and they got circulated. But almost nobody heard Lincoln give the Gettysburg Address either. I mean, all this depends on literacy and the growth of it.
One reads your book and realizes also at this early point in the history of the Republic how important all of the internecine and different kinds of warfare that was going on in one sort or another, diplomatic and just about everything imaginable, between Britain and France was in shaping this country.
The American Revolution is the product of Anglo-French rivalry on the northeast coast of this, the coast and the northeast of this continent, yeah. I mean, it's decided. The American Revolution, in my opinion, is decided once the British remove the French from Quebec in 1759 and take over Canada, because the colonists, who are mainly but not entirely English-speaking and English origin, no longer need British protection from France. After that, they can have their own ideas. They don't have to cluster under the Union Jack to protect them from the French Empire. They have ideas of their own, and it doesn't take very long for that to materialize. But for most of all of Jefferson's life, everything was still conditioned by the rivalry between Britain, France, and Spain in the region, and down to the Caribbean basin and along the Mississippi. His achievement as what I call a nation builder is watching for opportunities. When Britain and France, or Britain and Spain, or Spain and France quarrel, there's usually a chance for the United States, as it's now called, to grab a bit of territory, to expand its navy, to take advantage of superpower rivalry, and to become a continental power. That's his whole life. That's his aim, culminating in the Louisiana Purchase, I think.
Well, you mentioned him as the designer and architect of America in large part because of the land that was added by the Louisiana Purchase, but there are two other big episodes in American history that play a role, as you point out, in Jefferson's contribution: the Barbary Wars and the Lewis and Clark expedition. Yes.
The Lewis and Clark expedition set out on the day, the 4th of July, same day that the Louisiana Purchase was announced. And the great thing about Jefferson is he didn't know he'd get quite a chance to purchase Louisiana that way, but he had worked out a map in his head of how states would be added to the Union as it moved westward. So he wasn't just grabbing a chunk of land, he had a plan for it. And he was able to tell Lewis and Clark, now you have a plan too. The people you meet you can tell them no longer live in the French Empire. They live in the United States of America. Treat them as if they did. And this is evidence of some real intelligent design on his part. As for the Barbary Wars, I think it's extraordinary. It's very neglected. He had obviously wanted to have a serious fight with the Islamic piratical slave-holding powers of North Africa, who were not only interrupting shipping, shipping as it went through the Straits of Gibraltar into the Mediterranean, but were actually ranging themselves out into the Atlantic and taking cargoes of slaves, taking cargoes of ships, companies and passengers, and pressing them into service. We think maybe 1.5 million slaves, mainly European, owned by Arab Muslim despots in what are now Algeria, Morocco, Libya, and Tunisia.
Thus we get the shores of Tripoli.
The shores of Tripoli is why that's in the Marine Anthem. And Jefferson, for years, had decided that as soon as he was president, he was going to send a fleet and smash these powers and force them to stop doing it. So, which he did, without consulting Congress, without really letting anybody know he was going to, and with great ruthlessness and dispatch. It didn't take him very long to subdue them either. So we can say that there was at least one slave trade he did succeed in putting down.
Though he was against building up the American Navy, and yet this really in many ways brought into fruition what became American naval power.
I think I say at one point in the book that Jefferson was able to wear the medals of his defeats because he didn't want Hamilton to have a national bank. He didn't want the Hamiltonian mercantile policy that he thought favored Britain. But he gave in if Hamilton would recognize that the capital of the United States would be effectively in Virginia, in what's now Washington, D.C. He was willing to trade. So he had the Hamiltonian economy to work with when he became president. And he didn't want a standing army or navy of any size and fought against it. But he lost. So he had Adams's Navy and Marine Corps to work with when he became president in 1800. So he does take huge advantage of the reverses of his party and of his policy.
I want to mention something about Hamilton because we had Rand Chernow on, but first of all, when you mention the election of 1800, even there we get into the 3/5 of a vote. I mean, Jefferson again showing, I guess what you'd call ruthlessness, no?
Yes, certainly. I mean, he got the needful votes came from the states of what were to become the core of the Confederacy. The major slaveholding states, where they could register their slaves as 3/5 of a vote each and deliver them in that form to their preferred candidate, in this case Jefferson.
36 ballots in the House of Representatives.
36 ballots to get it through.
To get that through. We're talking again.
And if it hadn't happened, I really don't believe we would be living in the United States. The United States would have gone on for a long time, perhaps indefinitely, being to the North American continent what Chile is to the other side of the South, a long sort of ribbon of territory going down the coast between the ocean and the mountains.
Mentioning, again, the French-British rivalry and how that plays in, because to a great extent Hamilton, of course, was certainly, I guess, what you could describe in today's terms as an Anglophile in many respects, and Jefferson had served in France and certainly was much more Gallic-minded and supporting of France. When somebody named Genet, and I don't mean Jean Genet, obviously, but somebody named Genet came to Washington, to town, talk about Jefferson's defeats. I mean, this was after the Revolution. You paint this guy as probably one of the most tactless and crass diplomats to come across the Atlantic in certainly long time. And
since Joseph Kennedy was sent to London to be an apologist for Hitler in 1937, I think. Yeah.
I wonder what you'd pull out in that analogy. But, I mean, Jefferson was terribly embarrassed by this and suffered because of it.
He suffered greatly. He suffered, in general, for his very fiery enthusiasm for the French Revolution. He was practically certain that it would be friends of his and of America's, like the Marquis de Lafayette, who triumphed in Paris. He had good reason to think so. He helped to write the Declaration of Human Rights for the French Revolution. He didn't see coming the terrible force of Jacobinism, the terror. And he left Paris by the time it hit, so he didn't have a sense of how grim it was going to be. He only saw the heroic moments, the fall of the Bastille, the proclamation of something like a new France and so forth. But he was determined to keep, keep enthusing